Well, I think to answer that question, Saul, you have to analyze the nature of Southern politics since the 1950s. What you had in the 1940s is basically, well, I think Southern politics began with VOT's book. And what he did was analyze the Democratic Party, because you didn't have a Republican Party. He basically came up with the idea that parties is very factionalized. He came up with three different types of state parties. It was all within a democratic framework, and it was all personality, cult-oriented type things. Race was not really an issue. Race didn't become an issue in the South again until 1954. Race could become an issue if someone happened to be soft on the issue, but no one was. So everyone was operating within the framework of a segregated society, so race never became an issue. Obviously, from 1954 to 1966, that 12-year period, race was the issue. And you can analyze, Earl Black wrote a book called Southern Governors and Civil Rights. There hadn't been a comprehensive book written like Key wrote, but Southern Governors and Civil Rights analyzes that period pretty good. And basically what he came up with is the segregation candidate. The candidate who best handled the segregation issue between 54 and 66 basically was the winner. But importantly, the race question was the issue in all Southern races. This continued up to 70. Now, once you had the Voting Rights Act in 64 and 65, by 66, blacks were participating enough in the system where by 70 was the first year. Race was still the dominant issue, but the candidate, but moderates were consistently winning primaries by 70 because you had a large number of blacks. In 70 is a good year to use because that's you had Jimmy Carter, you had Dale Bumpers, you had Reuben Askew, you had Bill Brock, you had John West, across the board. That was a new breed of Southern politicians. To some extent because they were image guys and media was being used, but more importantly, that was the first year statistically that blacks were participating enough to where a moderate would get to the primary.
I think that was also the year that Carter ran against Sanders using race.
66 Carter ran against Sanders. 66 race. Carter, by the way, is an interesting phenomenon. Most people don't know this, but you can get acetate. Carter ran a race against Sanders. No, wait a minute. Let me think of the Carter thing. Carter ran first against Lester Maddox.
Yeah, the Sanders thing was said.
Yeah, the Sanders thing, you're right. That's when he did the baseball pictures and all that. But that was that was not overt racism and so forth. But he was doing that in a Democratic primary, positioned himself to come back in general election as the moderate against Hal Seward, the conservative. But by the way, just as a point of reference, what Carter did was go out in 66 and run as the moderate candidate against Lester and lost, and then he used the Lester-Maddox formula, the same formula Maddox used.
That was also true of George Carter Lawrence.
Oh, sure.
When he first ran.
Well, his famous, I ain't going to be out niggers thing.
Right. All right, go ahead.
But the point I'm making is race was the dominant issue in Southern politics, all through the 50s, the 60s. The 70s began two things, really. Competitive two parties. 60s, you had the Goldwater phenomenon, and you had Nixon and so forth. But basically, the 70s is when you had a crystallized two-party thing beginning. So in 1980, I think the crucial thing in 1980 is, number one, the two dominant issues in Southern politics, which had been race and party, meaning you have to be a Democrat to win, had pretty well dissolved. And the main issues became the economy and national defense. Now, that's interesting in that those are the issues, basically, that Goldwater. In other words, the South in 1964 was considered reactionary, Neanderthalic, and so forth. because we want mainstream on, not only on the race thing, but on the economic issues and national defense and all. We were considered, you know, ultra conservative and everything. What happens is a guy like Reagan, who campaigns in 1980 on a 1964 Goldwater platform, minus the boo-boos and obviously the Voting Rights Act, TVA, and all that bullshit. When you look at the economics and the national defense, what had happened is that the South went from being behind the times to being the mainstream. In other words, so what you had was two things happening that totally washed away the Southern strategy, the Harry Dent type Southern strategy, and that is, that whole strategy was based, although it was more sophisticated than a Bilbo or a George Wallace, it was nevertheless based on coded racism. The whole thing, busing, we want a Supreme Court judge that won't have bus. Anything you look at could be traced back to the issue in the old Southern strategy. Now, it was not done in a blatantly discriminatory way, but the Reagans did not have to do a Southern strategy for two reasons. Number one, race was not a dominant issue. And number two, the mainstream issues in this campaign had been, quote, Southern issues since way back in the 60s. So Reagan goes out and campaigns on the economics and on national defense. The whole campaign was devoid of any kind of racism, any kind of reference. And I'll tell you another thing y'all need to think about that's even surprised me, is the lack of interest, really, a lack of knowledge right now in the South among white voters on this Voting Rights Act. I brought all these Republican state chairmen up here to just kind of soothe them down and say, look, we're not, before we had this meeting, look, we may not do exactly what y'all like. And what I found out about is all of them were very passive. They said, we'll pretty well go along with whatever you want. And I've looked at polls in the last 4 or 5 months, and there's just no interest or no intensity on that thing among white voters. Now, that in 1969, me bringing up, or Harry Dent, rather than me bringing up those Southerners, would have been a very big reported thing. The Southerners would have come up here with some kind of manifesto. They would, that would have been a big, major news story, ongoing and all that
I'm
shit.
just wondering, though, how much residual there is to, okay, so there's no race, but there is busing as an issue. Busing. The president has made it a bit of an issue.
Okay, let's talk about what an issue is, Saul. When I talk about an issue, I say I'm a pollster, okay? I ask an open-ended question. What's the biggest issue facing you today? You poll 600 people, and then you put on a continuum. 45 to 55% will say economics. 12% will say national defense. Busing will not even register on the top 10. On an aggregate, busing hadn't been on the top 10 of open-ended issue questions in any poll I've seen since 1972. And it's gone, and now it's gone. No, excuse me, Saul, I don't know why. It's gone, it's been on the top 10, but it hadn't been the top 10. And by 1978 to 1980, busing hadn't even been a top 10 issue. So sure, everything's an issue, but I'm saying it's
I'm just wondering how much residual there is that cold racism in the anti-government, anti-Washington, states' rights, return to states' rights, defederalize, how much there is in the old days, the residual of the old days there is in the antipathy towards welfare programs, poverty programs, which are after all on blacks.
fine.
And other political, social, economic programs which do give power to black folks or poor folks or identify with giving power. But again, it's not purely Southern, but the Legal Services Corporation. They give problems to the municipalities of Mississippi who want to gerrymander. Those kind. I'm just wondering.
Well, sure, okay, but I think this, and don't get me wrong, you go out to these white country clubs, and they're still going to sit out there and say, well, shit, I'm tired of, I'm tired of getting everything and all that. But the bottom line is Don't get those out yet. I got to look at it. The bottom line is it's a mainstream thing now, and it's not grounded in racism as much as it is kind of the network movie syndrome. I'm mad as hell and I ain't gonna take it. Now, statistically, the poor people and the people receiving all these things are blacks. Now, some of the Southern stuff may still be racism, but it's such a widespread thing now, and I think it's almost developing into a class struggle type issue rather than a racism issue.
When you say widespread, you mean national?
I mean, I can go to a country club. I won't go to a country club. Hello? Okay. Hey, buddy. Fine, what's up? But what I'm saying is you can sit in a cocktail anywhere and they'll start saying, well, I'm tired of these fuckers getting welfare.
Anywhere in the
and all
country,
that.
yeah, that's
And,
what
it's
I'm
not,
saying.
and if it were white, it wouldn't make any difference. There's always going to be I'll say this, my generation, my generation, will be the first generation of Southerners that won't be prejudiced. Totally. I mean, hello? Well, y'all leave me alone. In other words, my parents and even people 5 and 10 years older than me were in touch with things that would feed into me in another period. But what I'm saying is that has really been sublimated by a bunch of other issues. But more importantly, is people in the South are just like any people in the history of the world. Once something becomes a reality, people adapt to it. We fought, we kicked, we struggled with all of these problems, first in 54, then the voting rights stuff in 64. But by 70s, it was a reality. And you just adapt to reality and move on. So I'm not saying that it was done down there because we thought it was great or we finally understood or anything. It became a part of our life. So in these 80 elections, and so when I'm saying back to our Southern strategy, so the Southern strategy now, basically, and here's another thing, it's all you and I talked about, is who controls elections in the South. Statewide elections in the South are controlled by, if you want to use the term, George Wallace voters. Because statistically, blacks went for John F. Kennedy en masse, they went for Johnson en masse, they went for Humphrey en masse, they went for Carter en masse, and they went for Carter en masse, and McGovern en masse, all six. The country club whites went for the Republican every time in mass. So, the blue-collar voter in 1964 goes for Goldwater. He carries the deep South. Remember, the other two groups went the same way. 1968, the blue-collar voter goes for George Wallace. He carries the South, deep South. 1972, he goes for Nixon. 1976, he goes for Carter. Now, we're leading up to my whole strategy in the Deep South in 1980, which I discussed earlier. In other words, the whole focus group in the South is that blue-collar worker. Now, that's important when you tie it back into the racist thing, because he was also the guy who was most threatened by the black, and was also most prone to be, quote, a racist. And until 1980, and in a little bit in 1976, the race issue is how you approach that vote. Plus, the most conservative guy on fiscal matters always got his vote, and the toughest son of a bitch in national defense and foreign policy always got his vote. So what happened is Jimmy Carter in 76 was able, plus these people, regional pride is always biggest with the lower intellects and lower income groups. So on the basis of regional pride, I'm one of you, and fuzzing the issues and making it look like, being a born-again Christian, which smacks of conservatism, and trying to be conservative, he gets that group in mass in 76, carries the whole South. Well, once he got there, and this is an important point of what I'm going to say, it was his to lose. It wasn't ours to win, it was Carter's to lose. All Carter had to do was run in place. Well, he didn't do that. He took that for granted, he went out, didn't stay on the issue, and we were able to go back in, which I didn't think we were going to be. I thought we could really lay the hamstring and bring it back